Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matt Lindstrom, and I have the privilege of serving as the Edward Henry Professor of Political Science and the Director of the Eugene J. McCarthy Center for Public Policy and Civic Engagement, serving the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University here in central Minnesota. Thank you for joining us today for the 14th Annual McCarthy Lecture. While we wish we could welcome back Dr. Jameson to our campuses, we are so glad you are all with us today. On this very first St. Ben's and St. John's Community Engagement Day, and during these contentious and confusing times, it is fitting that we feature Dr. Jameson as this year's McCarthy Lecturer. Like former Minnesota Senator Eugene McCarthy, Dr. Jameson's work is a perfect example of the importance of the liberal arts, community engagement, and the pursuit of the common good. She is a professor of communication, and her research consistently wins accolades and awards from across a wide variety of disciplines and professions. On behalf of the McCarthy Center, I want to first thank the great staff at Fine Arts Programming for their tech help, and Anna Jonas for her help in distributing Dr. Jameson's great new book. Second, a big thanks goes out to our financial benefactors, Dan and Catherine Whalen, as well as today's co-sponsor, Professor Nick Hayes and St. John's University Chair of Critical Thought. Finally, I'd like to introduce two student coordinators from the McCarthy Center who will play a role in today's program. First, Laurel Poole is a senior political science major with an English minor. She went to high school just outside Portland, Oregon, and she is one of the McCarthy Center's student leaders in CSB SJU Votes, a bipartisan Get Out the Vote effort. Laura will facilitate today's question and answer portion of the event. Finally, Elliot Edinburgh is a senior from Central Minnesota, and he's double majoring in Hispanic Studies and Political Science. He's a student leader in the McCarthy Center's events team and active in a variety of student organizations, including Extending the Link, a campus documentary film group. Elliot, over to you.
Thanks, Matt. Since my first year of college, this lecture has easily been one of my favorite annual college events, and I'm honored to introduce our speaker today. Although I have to say, I never imagined that I might be giving a virtual introduction while wearing basketball shorts from a dimly lit college house. Dr. Kathleen Hall Jameson is a professor of communication at the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School, the director of the university's Public Policy Center, and a graduate of St. Benedict's High School in our own St. Joseph, Minnesota. Her roots to St. John's and St. Ben's run deep, and she even campaigned for Eugene McCarthy in his bid for the 1968 Democratic presidential nomination. She has authored or co-authored 16 books, and her most recent book, Cyber War: How Russian Hackers and Trolls Helped Elect a President, won the R.R. Hawkins Award from the Association of American Publishers. The book earned praise for its empirical-based assessment of Russian influence in the 2016 election. As a Facebook user whose data was exploited in 2016, the first election I voted in, I look forward to hearing her speak about Russia's role in influencing the electoral process. Dr. Jameson is also the co-founder of factcheck.org, a nonpartisan, nonprofit resource that aims to reduce the levels of deception and confusion in United States politics, and recently received the 2020 National Academy of Sciences' most prestigious award, the Public Welfare Medal. The Academy recognized her nonpartisan crusade to ensure the integrity of facts in public discourse and promotion of public understanding of complex issues. A renowned academic, author, and promoter of democratic justice, we are deeply honored and grateful to have Kathleen Hall Jameson as the speaker for our 14th annual Eugene McCarthy Lecture.
Thank you, Elliot, and thank you, Matt. It's a pleasure to be with you. I wish I could be on your campus today. I remember how beautiful fall was in Minnesota across our two campuses, in particular, the spectacular woods in between. And I remember with great fondness and affection the kind of collaborative relationship between the two schools then. I'm now pleased to say it's even closer. My brother's a St. John's graduate. Two of my sisters are St. Ben's graduates as well. And so we have a strong, long family history to both of the colleges, although with women in my family, it's through the high school. I'm pleased to be here for another reason, and thank you for welcoming me back. As a very young political activist, I was clean for Gene, and did so in part because we were involved as a country in a war I didn't think we should be in. Something that I realized as a high school debater when we were debating a foreign policy topic, and the topic was the Vietnam War. You couldn't win if you were as good a team on the circuit as the very best. You couldn't win the affirmative case on Vietnam against a strong negative. The arguments just simply weren't there for why the U.S. was in that war. And in that time, it was Eugene McCarthy who stood up against the Democratic establishment in a very unlikely race for the presidency and gathered up a whole lot of people who are the age of those of you who are in college and high school now to be his army to try to create systemic change. Out of that moment in our lives, and we are now the senior generation, we're the generation that's now moving into retirement, we learned something really important, which is that individuals can make a difference. Eugene McCarthy did make a difference. He helped redirect the country. He helped change the dialogue about that war. And although he didn't win the presidency, he won the hearts and minds of a whole lot of young activists who then spent, I believe, the rest of their lives, to the extent that they're still with us, trying to ensure that they lived up those kinds of ideals and that they engaged in the kinds of social action that they thought could produce productive change as well. So I'm a legatee of Eugene McCarthy. I'm indebted to Eugene McCarthy. And the values that he expressed are consistent with the values that are taught and incarnated in these two fine institutions that are sponsoring this lecture today. I'm pleased to be here for another reason, because we're celebrating the 19th Amendment. We're also celebrating the life and legacy of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And as the graduate of what was then an all-girls school and on a campus that was then an all-women's college, I came to appreciate the importance of women in leadership providing role models for other women in leadership. Ruth Bader Ginsburg certainly did that for many, many people across the United States. And her generosity of spirit, as well as her fine legal mind and her many contributions to the country's legal principles and understandings of the Constitution, are the things we all ought to be celebrating today. So with a nod to my past, both at St. Ben's and occasionally coming over to St. John's to watch those football games and occasionally debating with that debate team, and with gratitude for my family, my brother and my sisters, all of whom are indebted to you, as am I, for a very fine education, I'd like to talk with you today about what it is that we can think about as we think about the Russian intrusion into our election in 2016. And I'm not going to reprise the argument in the book, which I believe some of you have copies of. And I thank you for the thoughtful questions, by the way. Some of you teed up questions in advance, which suggests that you've read the book. But instead of asking the question, how did the Russians help elect Donald Trump? I'd like to reframe the analysis to ask, what can we learn by the kinds of interventions they used to try to influence us about the ways in which interventions of that sort, they wouldn't necessarily have to be from Russia, can potentially influence us as voters? And the process to ask, how can we increase the likelihood that we're not going to be susceptible to them? So the first question always when you're writing or talking about something that happened in 2016, and it's still going on, is, well, what's this to do with today? So yesterday, as I was reading my newspaper, and Gary, if you'll put up the first slide, what you see is, here's the title of the talk, but this was in yesterday's newspaper. Russia continues aggressive interference operation and broader influence operations aimed at divisions within countries and among allies. And that includes the United States. So this isn't just a history lesson. This is a question of what can we learn to minimize the likelihood that we're susceptible. As we know, Special Counsel Robert Mueller characterized those interventions as sweeping and systematic. They were very, very widespread. You've got 126 million Americans who may have seen IRA, that's Internet Research Agency, Think Russia, linked Facebook posts and ads, 1.4 million US users exposed on Twitter. You also had a dramatic amount of content hacked from the Democrats and dropped into our media system. And some of you are going to be reporters. Imagine that you're in a newsroom and suddenly across a very limited period of time, a matter of months, 150,000 new items have to be evaluated for their newsworthiness. Well, you can understand how deluged with all of that information, you might make some mistakes that you wouldn't make if, say, you only had to look at one or two pieces of new information, or even 10 or 15. So the hacked content that entered our media stream overwhelmed our journalistic community. And in the process of covering it, they made some mistakes that made us more vulnerable. So I'm going to focus on the Russian activities, including those two categories of activity. But first, let me remind you that on most of our cable systems, and I should have checked with my sister who lives in Bloomington, or my brother in Minneapolis, to ask, do your cable systems have RT in the Minneapolis area where they live? But in cable systems across the country, you'll see RT. You'll see it in your hotel rooms when we go back to ever being in a hotel. RT is formerly Russia Today. That means that we've got an outlet in our living rooms and hotel rooms in which the propagandists in Russia are actually talking to us directly. And if you don't know that RT means Russia Today, they changed the name, but RT is really Russia Today, you might actually be subject to propaganda and not know that you are. The same thing with Sputnik, which is largely known as a radio channel in the United States. And then you've got the troll activities. They're largely covert. Those are the people pretending to be us in cyberspace. You've also got the Russian hackers. Those are covert as well. We don't see them. Now, remember, RT and Sputnik, you can go watch them. They're out here in the open. The trolls and hackers, they're working behind the scenes. And also, we have an integrated campaign that was set to be dropped on the American people when Hillary Clinton won the presidency. And now think back to 2016. The polls were suggesting Hillary Clinton was going to win. The Trump campaign thought Hillary Clinton was going to win. Hillary Clinton thought Hillary Clinton was going to win. Barack Obama thought Hillary Clinton was going to win. And the Russians thought Hillary Clinton was going to win. So the Russians had a plan to delegitimize her election. Now, I know some of you are Republicans and some of you are Democrats. So I want to ask you to do something for me. I want you to step back and stop thinking about Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump and just think the Russians don't really care whether a Democrat or a Republican is in the White House. The Democrats want to do a good job for the country. The Republicans do too. What the Russians want to do is do a good job for Russia. So the Russians want to make the U.S. look bad. And they also want to help support a candidate who will help them in some ways. But they have another objective to make us look bad. They could intervene on behalf of a Democrat in the future as readily as a Republican in the future. So as we talk about this election, if you could step back from saying, well, I didn't like Hillary Clinton anyway, or I didn't like Donald Trump anyway, and ask, what does it mean to say that a foreign power comes in an attempt to influence regardless of the outcome? We should think it's problematic whether it's a Democrat, a Republican, an independent, a libertarian, a Green Party candidate, or a vegetarian anarchist. So I'm going to be presupposing that these delegitimation strategies are of interest to us regardless of our political party. So this is going to be the basic structure I'm going to talk through in the next 30 minutes or so. So first, let's look quickly at RT and Sputnik. If you take a look at the piece on the screen, what that is RT trafficking out the misinformation that a young man named Seth Rich is actually responsible for the hacking. Now, Seth Rich was tragically killed early one morning in a DC street. He worked for the Democratic National Committee. And the Russians were trafficking out the idea that he, not the Russians, had done the hacking. It's a distraction. How are they doing it? They're pushing it on RT, and they're then pushing it through the social media posts of the trolls, those cyber warriors pretending to be us, but they're actually in St. Petersburg, to try to deflect attention from themselves. So they use their media operations for that end. You're seeing it here as well, only here you're seeing it through Sputnik. So next. You also have the trolls. And the trolls' activities are all over the place. If you just paid high attention to news, you'd think it was just Facebook and Twitter, and maybe you'd learn that it was Instagram. Well, what we now know, which we didn't know in 2017, 2018, what we now know is the Russians started out with a lot of activity on Facebook in 2016, and as they got shut down, they started to shift. So they're moving a lot of their activity over to Instagram. And by the way, the whole time they were on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, they were in a lot of other places as well. So what's the first lesson? Look for foreign interference any place we've got a social media audience for them to try to reach. We're in a global environment. They can disguise who they are really readily. We don't see their geolocation. We don't see their faces. We don't have a good way to check who they are. The platforms largely have to shut that down. But we can remember that if we're in social media space, in any place on social media space, the likelihood is they're probably there too. And what's important about that is we use sources to judge messages. So largely, if the source seems credible to us, if it seems like something we identify with, we're more likely to accept the content. And once we start accepting the content, we're more likely to accept even more insidious content later because now we trust the source. So that's why this is important. The Blacktivist site, which is the Russian troll site, got more social media traction than the Black Lives Matter site, which is, of course, the US site, which is the site of an important social movement, which was in the United States. The @10_GOP presence is a Russian presence. That website is supposed to be Tennessee Republicans. They're pretending to be Tennessee Republicans. Their site got more traction than did the Tennessee Republican site. So if you trust the site because you think it's something it's not, it's more likely to be able to propagandize you. So what were the Russians about? They were trying to magnify fears and trying to suggest that cultural change is problematic. Now, I'm not going to read some of this content. I just find it offensive. I'm just going to show it to you. But you can see in some cases they're appealing to one side, another to another. Part of what they're trying to do is royal discontent. But part of what they're trying to do is to find the people whom they want to give messages to. When you respond by liking and sharing something, you're telling them something about you. And once that signal is sent into social media space, in Facebook, for example, you can use the lookalike function to find out what kind of people are responding to your message. And now you know how to find a target audience. So some of this that looks benign is actually trying to find you, figure out what people like you are like demographically so that they're better able to target you. We need to remember when we're in social media space that there's an enormous amount of data that is being transferred into cyberspace every time we click on a link, we share, we follow, etc., and that it can be exploited and as a result create vulnerabilities. Next. You also see some pretty harsh rhetoric here. Now, there's also a lot of pretty harsh rhetoric inside the US media system. Largely what the trolls did was amplified what was already here. And that raises another point for me. If a first is source matters, so watch out to make sure the source really is what you think it is. A second is that what you've got is when trolls communicate to you and they suggest that they're like you, they are now able to aggregate you into groups and target you with other kinds of information. And when they target you with information, even if there's information of that kind already out there, imbalances in information, imbalances in content potentially create effects. Now, they don't create effects on everybody. They create effects on people who are susceptible to them. And in most elections, our minds are made up. We're Democrats or we're Republicans. We pretty much know which side we're going to vote for. On average, 90% of those who say they're Democrats will vote for the Democrat. And on average, 90% of those who say they're Republicans will vote for the Republican. So that doesn't leave a whole lot of people who aren't already pretty much having their mind made up. But those independents are more easily persuaded. They're not as tightly anchored to party. Also, when an electoral audience consists of people who just don't much like either candidate, and that was the case in 2016, a lot of people did not like either Clinton or Trump. They didn't agree with either Clinton or Trump. They didn't like their temperaments, either Clinton or Trump. So they had real problems, but they nonetheless wanted to vote. Those people are subject to persuasion. Those kinds of categories meant that in 2016, a very unusual year, we had a higher level of undecided voters going into the last month and a half than we historically do. So why could the Russians create an effect? Because they had more people susceptible to an effect. And imbalances in messages, more messaging that hurts a candidate can be more powerful. Imbalances in messages shift votes on the margin among the undecided. And if the number of undecided is larger, that's a larger pool that you potentially can influence with imbalances. So what are the Russians trying to do? They're trying to find the evangelical Christians and conservative Catholics who are white. They're trying to find military veterans and households because if these categories of individuals vote, they're highly likely to vote for the Republican. They're trying to find the African American community, the Black constituency. If they're going to vote as a constituency, they're likely to vote for the Democrat. And they're trying to find young liberals and Sanders supporters whom if they can't get to vote for Trump, and they are going to have trouble doing that, they will try to shift over to a third party candidate. That candidate is Stein. And they're trying to, within these three groups, create message imbalances so that you hear more bad stuff about Hillary Clinton. Largely, they're not saying good stuff about Donald Trump. Largely, they're saying bad stuff about Hillary Clinton. And the message imbalances are trying to push people who might otherwise not go to vote. There's a difference between trying to persuade someone who's going to vote about how to vote and people who are not going to vote or vote. We don't know whether they should or should not vote. There's a different kind of messaging. So one is a mobilizing, demobilizing. The other is, okay, I know you're going to vote. I want to shift you the way I want you to go. What they're trying to do is take constituencies Donald Trump needed and mobilize. So they're trying to find those constituencies and then give them an imbalance in messaging against Hillary Clinton because they want them to vote. Now, why would evangelicals and white conservative Catholics not be enamored of Trump? Remember, if they're going to vote, they're likely to be Republicans. Well, he's carrying some liabilities. He's been divorced 3 times. He's said some unusual things about his sex life. He's been on Howard Stern saying things that are vulgar. He said avoiding Vietnam was, he was basically his avoidance of Vietnam. He had his own sacrifices and his struggles with all of that. But I won't be specific in the language that he used. But it's problematic and it's sexually related language. So what you have is an attempt to reach people who are saying he doesn't have my values. This doesn't look like what I, as an evangelical Christian, a conservative white Catholic, would likely to support. He's not living the kind of life. And he was once pro-choice. So do you believe him on pro-life? So now what they're trying to do is to shift the imbalance against Hillary Clinton enough that those categories of people who are feeling ambivalent about Trump, but if they will vote for Trump, will actually vote and hence vote for Trump. And that's what you're seeing with these messages. They're trying to find you as a category. They're then trying to create a message imbalance that will mobilize you to vote. If Donald Trump gets the percent of the evangelical Christian and white conservative Catholic vote that he has in August, in November, he loses the presidency. Mobilization is incredibly important. The next constituency, if the black vote votes at the level that it voted, or the military vote is the second vote. Thank you, Gary. Military vote is the second vote. Military individuals will largely vote for Republican. On average, much higher proportion will vote for a Republican. So, but here's the problem. You've had Donald Trump said negative things about Gold Star family. Donald Trump didn't consider John McCain to be a hero. And Donald Trump had a lot of deferments in Vietnam, one for a transient bone spur. So you can't, imagine a military household saying, well, I'm really excited about those things. But if those in a military household, including veterans, are going to vote, they're likely to vote for Donald Trump. So again, find them, find appeals to them, try to create a negative contract, try to focus also on issues that will benefit Donald Trump. So a third point, if the first is source and the second is imbalance, a third point is try to find issues that are salient, that if you cast your vote on those issues, will favor one candidate. We know in 2016, if you feature immigration on average with white constituencies, with veteran constituencies within those, you're more likely to get a Trump vote. If you feature healthcare, you're more likely to get a Democratic vote. In fact, that's generally true across the electorate at large. So if you pick issues and make them more salient and create message imbalances with a credible source, you increase the likelihood you're going to mobilize those votes. And a moment on source. When you take a message from social media and you transfer it to your friends, you share, or when you like it, you are signaling that it is an important message. And when you send it and you share it, your credibility is certifying the message. So a really successful troll campaign gets you to share troll content. Now you're not asking that first question, what is the source? Because they know the source. The source is you. Before we share, we need to be really careful that we know what we're sharing, that we know that it's accurate. We know that we want to stand behind it, because essentially we are when we send it to our friends. So you see some of the messages that were used to mobilize and demobilize. Let me move to the next category. Now we're moving to demobilizing. Well, how do you demobilize? You essentially say, now first let's look through the pattern. You're going to attack Hillary Clinton. Next, you're going to offer statements that are problematic and in this case untrue. Bill Clinton sired, according to this allegation, a child with a black prostitute and is covering it up. Next, you're going to get message that will simply find your audience. This helps you find your audience. Next, you're going to find ways of identifying, and then you're going to say, I can't support either side. They're both the same. They're both oppressors. There's no difference between the two. And then finally, you're going to put in place misinformation about voting. You cannot text to vote. And here you're harnessing a campaign by a person of color in the celebrity culture who is leading a vote, get out the vote drive. You're just putting a false message up in front of his face in his appeal. So these are demobilizing appeals in the Black community. Now let's go back and say what actually happened. The military households, if they were to vote at the level they supported Trump in August, will vote at a low enough level that he will not win the White House. The same thing with evangelical Christians, white conservative Catholics. If they vote at the level they're supporting him in August, he cannot win the White House. By November, he has enough support by both to bring him up to the average of his party. He was mobilizing too. The question is, how much did the Russians add to it? On the Black vote, demobilized. With Black vote votes at the level it voted for Barack Obama, and you still have the mobilization on the other side that I've already described, Hillary Clinton wins the White House. However, the Black vote was cast at the lowest level it had been in 20 years. It was demobilized. Now, part of that demobilization was making appeals to things Hillary Clinton had actually done and said. So it's not that there isn't some other set of arguments out there that would be demobilizing. There are. The statement about super predators, highly problematic for the Black community. The incarceration record of the Bill Clinton administration among those people of color, highly problematic for Hillary Clinton. It's not that there aren't some things out there that are problematic. There are. It's that you get message imbalances on top of that and these appeals. So the question would be, did the Russians make a difference by the message imbalances? And then finally, they tried to shift the Sanders supporters and young liberal supporters away from Hillary Clinton. Now, Hillary Clinton's supporters and Sanders supporters and Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders had a tough primary. So there are a lot of disaffected Sanders supporters. And here's the kind of appeals they made to try to reach the Sanders supporters. Now, that looks just like a Stein ad. This is very effective messaging. But where did they get it? They're just lifting it up out of what's already in social media for Stein. They're largely amplifying. We had enough shifting of votes from Stein away from her party totals from the previous election in 2 of 3 of the battleground states that decided the election to have made a difference. Now, what can we step back and say with this? We can say we can learn some things about trusting source. We can learn some things about how we are targeted as individuals, and then how people like us are aggregated and appeals are made to us. We can say some things about how message imbalances potentially affect us. And we can say some things about how if you can shift the agenda by having more messaging about issues that help one candidate and hurt the other, you can shift votes on the margin. We had enough susceptible votes in 2016 to at least plausibly say there's potentially an effect. But that's not my important argument here. It is, see the susceptibilities, well, see the ways you potentially would counter them. Now let's move to the next argument. Here's the Jill Stein appeal. And very quickly, let me show you why Jill Stein and not a libertarian. Next slide. This is the RT, that's Russia Today, 10th anniversary celebration. You see a familiar face there, that's Michael Flynn. There's Vladimir Putin. And who's that in the far right? Oh, yes, that's Jill Stein. Why shift to Jill Stein? Because Jill Stein's policies were more compatible with Russia's interests. And as a result, across RT and Sputnik, you saw a lot of other promotion of Jill Stein. Next slide. And that takes us to the hackers. The second thing we need to worry about is right now we know the Russians are trying to hack into political accounts. And our press made possible whatever effect the hackers had. So did uses in the campaign. But the failures of the press were really large and egregious. Reporters failed to source the content that they got through hacking to either the Russians or Julian Assange, the co-founder of WikiLeaks, who is in fact putting the materials out. They downplayed or ignored the October 7th confirmation that the Russians were behind the hacking. Reporters failed to note the lack of independent verification of the hacked content. Now, these are basic journalistic norms. The hacked content wasn't subject to tests of newsworthiness in any traditional sense. Hacked content was altered. It altered the media agenda. And last, at key moments, reporters took hacked content out of context. Now, why would they do this? They're not trying to elect or defeat somebody. I believe they're just simply overwhelmed. All that content is dumped on them. All the other news is churning around them. They were acting really, really quickly, and they made some serious mistakes in the process. Do I think they're going to repeat them if this happens again? I hope not. And I don't think they will. I mean, a common question when you look at the hacking is, well, would the press do a better job? One reason that the press trusted the content and treated it the way the press did was the press trusted WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks had worked with the press in the past, and sometimes in formal partnerships, to disclose content gotten from government sources. Leaked sometimes instead of hacked, but nonetheless gotten from government sources. It had been a reliable source of information. And another question I get a lot is, well, do you object to everything that's hacked and leaked? Well, I object to illegal content, illegal access to getting content. Stealing things from people's computers is illegal. But take a step back for leaking for a moment and say, there many times government is held accountable because someone leaks information. Look at the Pentagon Papers. So do we want reporters to have as their rule, never cover leaked content, never cover hacked content? If they didn't do the hacking themselves as reporters, hence they're not the ones engaging in the illegal activity, they didn't do the leaking, but they took it from someone who did. And it holds government accountable about, for example, abuses or lying to the American people. You don't want to, I don't think, say to journalists, well, no, you shouldn't take that. I think you should vet it really carefully. I think you should try to independently confirm it. I think you should say when you haven't been able to independently confirm it that you haven't been able to. I think you should indicate the sourcing, or when it's problematic about the sourcing, indicate that you haven't been able to identify it. And in the case of the Russian hacked content trafficked through Julian Assange, you should have said, Julian Assange is on the record opposing the Clinton candidacy, and as a result, we're going to look at this with extraordinary care. Because this isn't just him dropping stuff that he got someplace. This is a strategic set of moves on his part. Gee, we're not getting the content in the order it was gotten. It's not chronological. It appears to be strategically deployed at points that would do maximum damage to Clinton. Wonder why he's doing that. Wonder if that's selective. Wonder if we should trust his framing. So they didn't tie back to Assange. They should have. And to the extent that they could know that it was Russian hacked, and they could know that as of the October 7th confirmation from the intelligence agencies, they should have said illegally gotten by Russians. Now, the reason that matters is, imagine for a moment you're a journalist and you're sitting at your desk and your mobile phone rings and you pick it up and you hear on the other end of the line, hello, my name is Boris. I'm calling from Moscow. I got some materials that we stole from the Democratic National Committee, and I'd like you to write stories about it. What would you guess the journalist would do with that phone call? Well, they'd write a story about the fact that the Russians were trying to influence the campaign. Well, in essence, by laundering the material through WikiLeaks, the Russians managed to distance themselves from it, and reporters didn't write as many of the kinds of stories as they should have about the Russian origin of hacked content, and did not, as a result, ask the question, what is the advantage that Russia would gain by having Donald Trump elected, if any? We don't know, if any, but you would have looked at that question, journalists, and they would have asked, is Julian Assange playing us or not? And one more thing, if they kept Russian origin, and Julian Assange has a candidate in this race that he opposes, they would have been more careful in their use. They treated this as if it were legitimate content and that they could trust it. And they acted really quickly, and sometimes they just got it wrong. Let's look at how the hacked content altered the media agenda. This is references to WikiLeaks by outlet. You can see conservative outlets used it, but see the Washington Post there? See the New York Times there? It's got enough play that it altered the media agenda and the amount of content hostile to Hillary Clinton in news, not just for a day, but for weeks, because the Russians, through Julian Assange, dropped content every single week from October 7th through the election. And so they kept feeding news new content, and it continued to get pickup. Remember, message imbalances create effects on the margin. Next headline. Here we see the difference between the Access Hollywood tape and searches for it and WikiLeaks across time. Access Hollywood has small impact. WikiLeaks persisted and across time. And part of the why this is important is because on October 7th, when the intelligence agencies released their statement saying the Russians are behind the DNC hacking, the same day the Access Hollywood tape is released. You remember that for the vulgar language of Donald Trump. And now potentially the news agenda has two anti-Trump items in it. The Russians are behind the hacking, and it appears they're dropping things to favor Donald Trump. And secondly, WikiLeaks. Third, WikiLeaks is going to appear in a moment. Second, Access Hollywood tape. Well, that doesn't look good. White evangelical Christians, conservative evangelicals. What kinds of things is he saying? He's going to do what with women without their consent? What kind of vulgar language is this? At best, it's really vulgar. At worst, it's sexual assault. So imagine those two things dominating the headlines going into the second debate, October 9th. Russians behind this? Access Hollywood tape? The Donald Trump candidacy might have ended right there. We know from the Woodward book there was talk in the Republican high command of taking Trump down from top of the ticket, presumably with his consent, and moving Mike Pence up and moving Condoleezza Rice into the VP slot. It was that serious. Into that same day's news cycle, Julian Assange drops WikiLeaks and drops WikiLeaks Podesta hacked content, speech segments that Hillary Clinton delivered behind closed doors. That alters the media agenda to create an equivalence frame between WikiLeaks hacked content revealing these things about Clinton potentially and Access Hollywood, and the Russian hacking illegally gotten materials from the Democrats certified by our intelligence agency drops off the news cycle. It drops to the bottom of the fold in news. By Sunday, it is out of the news cycle completely. And for the rest of the campaign, it is underplayed as a result. So the first effect of the Russian interference is they changed the news cycle to counteract the negative news on October 7th. And that's potentially problematic if it could have ended the Trump candidacy. Next. So what did the press say after the fact? They recognized they had a problem and they made a mistake. Next. Here's a reporter who says, I didn't really look carefully at this. I took the headline. I chose the byline. Next. Here's a Pulitzer Prize winning team. This is New York Times. It says, every major publication, including the Times, published multiple stories citing the DNC and Podesta emails posted by WikiLeaks becoming a de facto instrument of Russian intelligence. So now what we got is they altered the media agenda. Imbalances potentially create effects. What's the lesson for us? Reporters, treat this really carefully. I would argue you got played by Julian Assange. At key moments, reporters also took hacked content out of context. Let me give you some illustrations because we've got a debate coming up next week. This is what the hacked content said. Here's the framing from it at the top. Hillary Clinton says, my dream is a hemispheric common market with open trade and open borders. Now read the rest of the sentence. Sometime in the future, with energy that is green and sustainable as we can get it, powering growth and opportunity for every person in the hemisphere. Did she come out for open trade and open borders? No. Hemispheric common market is what has open trade, open borders. First, that's our hemisphere. Secondly, it's sometime in the future. That's future tense, not now. Then the rest of the sentence says it's about energy, green and sustainable energy, promoting growth, etc. That's a single sentence. Now let's look at what happened to it. This is Sunday. Now this hacked content is released on Friday the 7th. This is Sunday the 9th, the day of the debate. ABC gets it right. Next. Face the Nation puts a period where there was none. Next. CNN puts ellipses. But at least they've got hemispheric common market in front of it. Next. Fox News puts ellipses and then quotes something next that is pages away in the same speech text. By the end of that Sunday morning, Hillary Clinton effectively said, I support open trade and open borders because the news covers had said she said it regardless of the context. Next. So here's what happens in the third debate.
In a speech you gave to a Brazilian bank for which you were paid $225,000, we've learned from the WikiLeaks that you said this, and I want to quote, my dream is a hemispheric common market with open trade and open borders. So is that your dream, open borders?
Well, okay, now that's when a moderator makes a statement, we treat it as fact because the moderator is the custodian of what we know. We don't think the moderator would have taken something out of context, nor do I think he deliberately did. I think in the rush to cover, this got abbreviated and people never went back to look at what it actually said. Now, why does this matter? Because it plays into a theme of Donald Trump's, which is that Hillary Clinton is hypocritical on trade, and she has changed her position on trade. There's actually something to this, but she's not coming out for the kind of open trade he says she supports. Also, open borders for Donald Trump is what I call a digestive or synecdochic statement. It stands for his entire attack on Hillary Clinton. It means Muslims coming into the country, refugees coming into the country. It means illegal immigrants coming to the country. It is a big, wide claim against Hillary Clinton, open borders. Now, she says she doesn't support either. But because this clip is there, Donald Trump is able to say, yes, she does. And when Donald Trump says she supports it, those patterns of press coverage seem to support him. So what's the lesson? Our press, confronted with hacking, needs to be extraordinarily careful, because in the process of what it covers, it can set a media agenda. It also needs to make sure what it's covering has been verified to the extent as possible. There was no serious challenge to the accuracy of any of the actual hacked content, by the way. That doesn't mean the press should not have pointed out that they hadn't independently verified. But their inference that it was trustworthy, I think, turns out to be accurate. But also, they need to be very careful to make sure they keep everything they've got, not only in the context of the hacked content itself, but the context of the source of the hacked material, in this case, the double source, the Russians and Julian Assange through WikiLeaks. Okay, now I'm going to move quickly to Democracy RIP. What had they planned to do? The fourth piece of the Russian plan. The third piece is they I believe, placed disinformation that affected James Comey, but you're going to have to read the book to get that one. The fourth piece, discredit the Clinton presidency. Here we go. They breached our electoral infrastructure, and they left fingerprints. Why would Russians leave fingerprints? Maybe so we could find them. Here's a question. We now know they're trying to be active inside our electoral structures right now. We've already found that out. Our intelligence community says, and they think they blocked them so far. But when somebody leaves fingerprints, you wonder, were they trying to be found? They may have been trying to place malware in our voting booths. Next, they activated a troll campaign at the end of that election alleging voter irregularities and fraud, and they insinuated sleeper personae alleging irregularities into mainstream news. Let's look quickly at the first. This is evidence of breach of the electoral infrastructure. Next. They wanted to come and monitor our elections in key battleground states. Now, this could just be the Russians trying to say, well, you're always sending monitors around the world, so we want to do it too. But there's another more insidious possibility. We have very localized elections. If you want to alter results, you probably need to be near either the voting booth itself and place malware into that structure, or you want to hack in and alter the rolls themselves. There's some possibility they wanted to be on site in order to tamper with some voting booths. We just don't know. At least it's a possibility. Next. They activated a troll campaign alleging voter irregularities. They're doing the same thing right now. By the way, we've already got that confirmation. And next. Remember I mentioned at 10_GOP, the Tennessee GOP? They posted this. This, remember, is Russians posting, pretending to be Tennessee Republicans. And guess who picked it up? Look at the top, the NBC News website. Imagine election eve, and now the election is really close, but Hillary Clinton has won the election, and that is sitting there. And now we have lots and lots of other sleeper sites pretending they're local news, pretending they're local Republican groups that we haven't identified, so we haven't blocked them. And they're now magnifying the perception that there have been irregularities. That could have been extremely damaging to a Clinton win. And remember that meddling that we found because the electoral infrastructure had been tampered with? That could call into question the vote as well. The question is, were they trying to call into question the vote? What we can guess is, no matter what their intent with this, ultimately this makes us look bad as a country, and that's a propaganda win for Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin. And with that, let me take your questions and your comments. So we'll go to Q&A.
So now we're moving into the Q&A. So all of you who are out there streaming, feel free to comment on either the YouTube or the Facebook, and it will go directly to us. Going into the first question, 4-star General Paul Nakasone is a St. John's graduate and current commander of the United States Cyber Command and director of the National Security Agency. If you were listening today, what would you recommend or say to him?
First, I'd say thank you. I am so grateful that you are there. We have such a polarized world right now that there's a tendency for everybody to suspect everybody. We have amazingly competent people throughout the entire governmental structure and through our entire military structure. They serve our nation really well. And this includes the scientists at the CDC and the FDA and the NIH. And it includes the generals and all the way down, the people who are leading our military. The United States has responded through its cyber capacities and through its electoral process to the Russian interventions. And when you listen to the rhetoric, you sometimes could think, oh, well, the Republicans haven't done anything. Well, first, Barack Obama put in place sanctions and he threw a bunch of Russian diplomats out of the country. Then the Republicans and Democrats passed serious sanctions and the president signed them and put them in place against the Russians. After that happened, the Russian activities continued. 2018, the United States hacked back against the Russians and their troll capacities. We know that. We knew it first because journalists broke the story, and months later, the president confirmed that it had actually happened. So they shut down a Russian operation that was trying to interfere in our election. And I assume the general, who's a graduate of St. John's, played some role in that. We ought to be really grateful for the people who've made these things happen. The Russians persisted after that. The question is, what do we have to do to get them to stand down? I would like to see our collective international community talk about at least having a cyber treaty in which we agree that we will not interfere in each other's elections. The US has interfered in elections too. And under this agreement, I would have the nations of the world agree that an attack on one is an attack on all and put in very serious sanctions so that if someone engages and it is confirmed, that nation becomes a pariah nation. I think if we put that treaty up, there's some possibility everybody could step down. That may be a naive view, but at least I think it's worth a try. I would also like to see a piece of bipartisan legislation that is sponsored by Van Hollen and Rubio, I believe, that would preemptively, before something happens, alert anyone out there, specifically the Russians, that if they engage in electoral interference, these penalties will fall into place, and the penalties are horrific. They are economic sanctions from hell, and that they cannot be taken down until there are multiple elections in which they're certified to be no other activity, and they cannot be taken down by the incumbent. So if you win the election because you benefited from that kind of activity, you don't get to take the penalty away. I wish that would get bipartisan agreement, and also that we would have a treaty surrounding it. And I would hope that people like your graduate, General Nakasone, would be at the table to have other good ideas for us about ways that we could better protect not just our elections, but elections around the world. We should want to protect the integrity of elections, period.
That's a really good point. So going into our next question, we recently celebrated the 100th anniversary of women's right to vote. What are the gender impacts of widespread and intentional disinformation in political campaigns?
I wrote a book called Beyond the Double Bind, Women in Leadership. And as part of that book, I talked with Ruth Bader Ginsburg about the cases that she had taken before the court. The argument in the book was that we make assumptions about gender, about race, about age that we are unaware of, that nonetheless affect the ways in which we behave and act. And that those are used to penalize. Now let's focus simply on gender. Those are used to disadvantage women in politics in very specific kinds of ways. If they're there and they're stereotypic, and you're not aware that you're affected by them, I can play on them very effectively with, for example, troll content. I can do the same kind of thing with race. I can do the same kind of thing with age. And let me move out of both the gender and the race category into age for just a moment. We all have age stereotypes, and the culture reinforces age stereotypes. We are seeing a campaign in which age stereotypes are being primed, made more salient on each side. We have two septuagenarian candidates running right now for president of the United States. And to the extent that we make stereotypic assumptions about age, we're more likely not to ask, what is the real evidence and what are you actually really claiming about the person? So the danger with stereotyping, particularly stereotyping that has discrimination at its core, as the activity associated with it is, that you can activate it without those who are being activated aware that that's what's happening to them. And as a result, and with female candidates, This takes the form of holding them to a higher ethical standard than we hold male candidates, presuming the male candidate's competency, making the female candidate establish that she is competent. We also have a likability standard for the female candidate, but not the male candidate. We have all sorts of words to explain, well, he's not really the nicest guy in the whole world, but an unlikable woman is much harder to elect. Now, notice how those kinds of things are at play against Hillary Clinton. And the notion that women are the weaker sex plays into the assumption that the woman is going to be more vulnerable to health problems, for example. So when Hillary Clinton has pneumonia, and makes the mistake of not telling people, a serious error, it plays into, well, she's the weaker sex. The assumptions that you make, women actually outlive men. On average, women are less susceptible to a whole lot of things, compared to men. But if you've got those assumptions underlying, you're not aware and you're not asking those kinds of questions. And so part of the reason that campaigns can work in social media is you get the signal on the internet. It just pops up. You react viscerally. You don't analytically say, do I accept that? And you share it and like it, thereby attaching your credibility and creating the social norm that suggests a lot of people agree with this to it, without being aware that what you've done is actually reinforce a stereotypic assumption.
So to follow that up, we have a question from YouTube, and that kind of goes into the predisposition on Hillary Clinton. Do we know why the Russians were interested in the election of Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton?
I can tell you why they're not interested in seeing Hillary Clinton elected. Vladimir Putin believes, or says he believes, that an uprising against him while he was seeking a re-election was prompted by a signal that Hillary Clinton gave to the rioters in the streets, or to the demonstrators in the streets of Moscow. And we know that at least he wants us to believe that he believes it because he said it. So he doesn't like Hillary Clinton. And it's fairly clear that Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, remember, usually you don't know much about what a candidate is going to do in relationship to Russia. You can use what the party would do as a rough heuristic or cognitive shortcut, but you usually don't know much about what a candidate's going to do about Russia. If she's been Secretary of State, you know a lot. So Hillary Clinton is known to be tough, quote unquote, on Russia. Putin knows that, and he's got a grievance against her. He believes she's the one who signaled to get those protests against him. Those were damaging to his regime. And you got one more thing. He blames the Obama administration for release of illegally gotten content, but that was nonetheless disclosed, that suggested that some of his financial dealings were somewhat problematic. So to the extent that he thinks that was the Obama administration that did that, and that made him look bad, he's now got 3 grievances against Hillary Clinton. And then Donald Trump has been in Moscow. Donald Trump would like to build Trump Tower there. We now know Donald Trump is trying to seek business relationships into his time running as a candidate. So if you could kind of, if you're Putin, as hard as that would be, and you say, well, gee, which one of these would I like to see? You know you don't want Hillary Clinton. And as a result, Donald Trump doesn't look like he's problematic. And Donald Trump during the campaign has made explicit statements about wanting to change the policy toward Russia. Now, you could say maybe it's desirable to change the policy toward Russia. So I'm not prejudging whether it's advantageous or not to have one position or another. But if you're Putin, I can see why on this race you do what is unusual. You'd expect ordinarily, given foreign policy history, the Russians would not want to see a Republican elected.
Yeah, so as we all know, the incumbent is running again. So are you seeing any patterns of disinformation and interference in the current political climate in 2020 election?
We are, and I don't know if Gary is able to do this or not. And Gary, I know you're back there somewhere. If Gary's able to do that, I have a series of slides that will show you what they're doing now. This is actually communicating COVID vaccination, but this is at the end of the cyber election. Gary, I don't know if you're able to do it or not. So it's the slides way at the end, right after Democracy RIP on the cyberware lecture. We know that they have been trying to hack. We know they've been in the electoral infrastructure. We think, based on what the government is telling us, our government is telling us that those have been to this point blocked. We know they've been putting forward misinformation and disinformation about Joe Biden in relationship to Ukraine. We know that they were playing a role in arguing it was Ukraine that did the hacking in 2016. It was not Russia. And we know that they are now fueling misinformation about COVID-19 in the United States. We know they've been trying to steal the U.S. vaccination, U.S. vaccination work from the U.S. drug companies, but they're probably trying to do that with everybody around the world. By the way, the Russians aren't just going after us. The Russians have been rampaging all over the world. And we can learn from those activities, and they can learn from ours as well. And we know that they're feeding a number of themes that advantage the Trump campaign. They're arguing that Biden is mentally incapable of governing, that he has dementia, senility, etc., which is a lot like their attacks on Hillary Clinton's health in 2016. We know that they are making the argument that the balloting structure in the United States is highly suspect and mail-in votes are. And that's aligned with the Trump arguments as a natural extension of what they were arguing before. And by the way, step back and say, they probably would like this argument no matter who the candidate is, because the United States has always gone around the world saying we stand for free and fair election. We'll send election monitors. There aren't free and fair elections in Russia. It certainly advantages Putin to be able to say, look, all of these problems inside the U.S. electoral system. So they might be magnifying those regardless of whether it advantaged Donald Trump. This year it advantaged Donald Trump. It's consistent with his rhetoric. So here's what we've got. We've got RT and Sputnik, social media activity, pro and con vaccination. This is to build their identity. We published this in Journal of Public Health. Their accounts, they were on both sides of the California vaccination debate. And some scholars said, oh, they're trying to push anti-vaccination. They were actually on both sides of the debate. And the reason we think is because we did a huge analysis of the troll content. They were trying to build the identity of their fake accounts. So their pro-Republican accounts were anti-vaccination because they thought Republicans are anti-vaccination. Their pro-Democratic accounts, because they're trying to create accounts on both sides, were pro-vaccination because they thought a Clinton supporter, a Biden supporter, a Sanders supporter would be pro-vaccination. We don't think what this was about was seeding disinformation so much as building their identity so that we would think that they were like us. Remember, that's the first move. If we think they're like us. And from a Catholic standpoint, go back to those slides that I showed you about appeal to evangelicals and white conservative Catholics. Remember the little girl who's standing there holding the crucifix? What you saw in the backdrop is a Marian medal. What you see, the pro-life appeals are appeals that are resonant within these communities. So the first thing they want to do is communicate, I'm like you. And once you say, oh yes, I like you, you're like me, I trust you, then they can give you disinformation. So we think they were building their persona. Next. We also have them planting imposter news articles. And one of the sites that was taken down is a site that had a great deal of this. They also have been pushing COVID conspiracies and the Giuliani conspiracies about Ukraine. Next. They've been trying to place opinion pieces in US media. The account called Peace Data was just taken down. That was a Russian account. So you're now seeing regular announcements from the platforms that they're taking down Russian accounts, and we're starting to learn as a result about the moves that they're making within them. You also have websites promoting disinformation about the pandemic. And by the way, one thing, when you're looking through the troll content in 2016, I know some of you must speak Russian. One of the cues that this is not English language in origin is that the indefinite and definite article are suppressed. So you get a cue that, no, they're not thinking in English. Well, what language does that? Oh, this could be Russian. Now you're not seeing those markers. Their English is far more fluent. The other way we should have spotted them in 2016, on the platforms at least, was when they tried to buy ads with rubles. You're buying ads with rubles, you're probably not a U.S. national. And by the way, foreign agents and foreign countries, foreign nationals are not supposed to, in our elections, to be able to buy ads. So they're also priming activity, which tries to help reelect Donald Trump. We also know that confirmed by our intelligence agency. But the intelligence language is denigrating Vice President Biden and boosting the Trump candidacy. Next. They're amplifying themes that are consistent with the Trump campaign: crime and violence in cities, mail-in voting is suspect, and an earlier one, which we jumped past, which is Joe Biden has mentally lost it. They're hacking activities. They're hacking. Woodward found more hacking than we knew about and reported in his book. They breached one more place in Florida than we knew they had in 2016. Next. This is the U.S. response. I mentioned the president confirmed that the U.S. had hacked back. This is our cyber warriors in action. This is the people that are in the circle that General Nakasone directs. So we've taken action back. And the question is, and our cyber commands would not be telling us what they're planning to do, but we know they did it in 2018. If I had to bet, I'd say they're ready to do it again. And hacking persists. It's already been identified. Malware placement. This is an interesting one because we're all using the Johns Hopkins website. They managed to plant into the interactive map a malware preloader. So that lets you steal passwords, and then you can send content to the victim's email list. So they're not just playing around with campaigns, they're playing around all over social media trying to get our information. Here's another instance of hacking from the news. And that was linked to political parties. And they've got scanning and probing of our election infrastructure. So are they still doing it? Yes. Now, the reason I highlighted this for you is when they say vast majority, my heart stops. I'd like that to not be vast majority. I'd like to be every single thing that's there. But of course, they can't say that because they can't know whether they got it all. And as we go back to 2016, then people say, well, we don't know of any instance in which they altered our electoral infrastructure. The important question is, could we have known if they did? You have to have specific kinds of interception at play to know that. And our secretaries of state across the United States have spent a lot of time now trying to protect electoral infrastructure. I hope now that they're not only going to be able to catch it, but they're going to be able to anticipate all the other ways that the Russians could move against the electoral infrastructure. Because if you really wanted to do in the election, here's a really good way. Go in and take every 10th name off the voter registration rolls, or take every name that has an ethnic or racial identification tied to it. So anybody whose name is George Washington last name is more likely to be Black than someone's name his name is Jose Padilla Alvarez. So you can identify by names which groups you'd like to pick off. Just pick off the groups that are most likely to benefit your opponent candidate and leave intact every place that the name is associated. Now, you're going to be wrong in a certain number of cases, but you could wreak havoc with our electoral system. Another scenario, which is the kind you work up in movies, but which causes nightmares for those who are responsible for protecting us, is what would happen if the Russians decided to take down the electrical grid and all the electronic voting went down, say, for 3 hours in blue states, or in another scenario, in red states. We're not really well equipped to handle those kinds of things. Now, that would be a direct act of war. That kind of intervention, you cross the line there in which there's no ambiguity. But nonetheless, it is a plausible way to interfere with an election. And I know that the United States has gamed that to see how would the United States protect against it.
So this moves really well into a question we've received about your interview with Philly Magazine. You discussed the decline of institutional trust in America. This is pertinent to governments during the pandemic, especially when a vaccine is on the horizon. So how can public trust in institutions be restored?
Well, first, I want to say something really important. Yes, there's been a decline in trust in institutions. Overall, trust in science is still very high. And I think of science as an institution. So there's a reservoir of trust there that is really important. But I mentioned that I'm doing a presentation with Dr. Fauci next week. And so I just put together some slides for this. So Gary had just put them up. Let me quickly give you a sneak peek, add some slides that I'll be showing at an international conference. These are things I think we need to do to bolster trust in the science, specifically about the vaccine. I think we should communicate the standards we use to assess scientific evidence so people know it's not arbitrary. Having a clinical trial that is placebo-controlled and randomized, and that as a result has the best possible data, we can know whether the drug did it or whether it didn't. So it's double-blinded, so nobody knows which person got the vaccine that had the real vaccine and which one got the placebo. Understanding that's how we know is really important because it's a protection. So nobody can just go make something up. and communicating the ways in which we evaluate what it is we know that can't be subject to political intervention. And so we have an independent board that reviews the vaccines. And then separately, independent statisticians review the data. And before the vaccine ever gets to that point, there are preset articulated standards about when we will shut down the trial because the vaccine has been effective enough, or when we'll shut down the trial because it's been ineffective, it's causing problems. But preset, you don't get to go in and change them around just because you don't like them. And then we need to communicate why widespread vaccination is needed within communities. There's a big misunderstanding in media right now. The media say we have to get to 67% vaccination to get what's called herd immunity. Please ban herd immunity from your vocabulary. We are not cows. The whole concept of herd immunity came out of animal studies, and we forgot to get rid of that language. If you say you need 67% of the American populace to be vaccinated, no, you actually don't. You need 67% in every community you circulate in. So there can be 67% in Pennsylvania. There can be 67% in the county I live in. There can be 67% in Philadelphia, which is the city I live in my community. My child's school, the PTA, Costco, where I shop to get my groceries. Those are all communities. If there's not 97% there, you can have spread there. So we have to have people understand why we need to get to a high level of community immunity. Now, national and local community immunity too, but community, meaning my community immunity. And then finally, we need to rely on trusted individuals to certify the safety and effectiveness, because we're not the scientists who will be able to actually read the data. And that's why it's so important that individuals that we trust are there. And if Gary can just fast forward the slides, I want to show you pictures of some people I think we can trust. So this is just going quickly through the slides. Too much technical scientific detail. Here we go. Here's Peter Mark. Hey, take a look at his face. He makes the decision about the FDA trials. He says he'll resign before he'll let something that's not safe and effective go forward. I trust him. There's Dr. Fauci. He says, when it's certified, when I'm satisfied, I'm going to take the vaccine. The regulatory process is going to have integrity. Next. He's saying he's going to take the vaccine when that threshold is set. There's Dr. Francis Collins, head of the NIH, saying the same thing. And there's Dr. Jerome Adams saying the same thing. He's our Surgeon General. When those three people, plus Peter Marks, tell me I can take the vaccine, I don't need all that other scientific evidence. I'm willing to trust them. We need, between now and the time of a vaccine rollout, to build trust and confidence that these people have the integrity that I believe they have to ensure that this is going to be safe and effective by the standards of good science.
So we're still seeing a large amount of information absorbed through the same media outlets. What would you recommend are the best practices to be an informed voter that evades disinformation in this election?
The candidates have websites with position papers on them. Read the position papers, read the statements they have made, look to see what they have done in practice. So don't just trust what they say they're going to do. Ask, what have you done on, and pick the issues that you care about. The issues I care about may be completely different than the issues you care about. But we now have the capacity, and this is a positive thing on the web, to say, I really care about X. I'm going to go find, what do they say they're going to do? What have they done? And what have they promised and not done? So I want to know how reliable their word is against what they say they're going to do. If they say they're going to be wonderful things, and I agree with, but every time they promise in the past in my area of interest, they've broken their promise, I'm not going to take their word. So this is a moment for voters not to think of themselves as a collectivity, but as a person who has informed issues that matter. And those are the issues that you're going to vote on. And for most of us, that's not many issues. That's 3, 4, 5 issues at the most. And then a general sense, and this is the next thing that I think matters, people are Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, Greens, because they philosophically share the presuppositions of a party. To the extent that you know that the candidate is acting and taking positions and his behavior or her behavior has been consistent with those and with your party, then trusting that the rest of what you know from the philosophical perspective of the party makes sense. Now, that means that, if you're of one party and I'm of another, we're bringing a different knowledge set to bear. But when you say I'm an X and you identify a party, you're actually saying something about your philosophy of governance. And the difference in philosophy of governance is real. And it's not that one's right and one's wrong. They're different. So which are you closer to? And then beware, because people are readily deceived about those things they assume about the other party. So if you assume that, a Democrat's going to raise taxes because that's what you assume Democrats are going to do, and a Republican's going to cut social programs because that's what a Republican's going to do, you're subject to deception. And the deception will be the Democrat's going to raise more taxes on more people than the Democrat actually says he will. The Republican's going to cut social programs at all or reduce the rate of growth more than the Republican actually will. And the first thing I want to find out is, are they going to do it at all? If they say they're not going to do it at all, then go back to point one and say, okay, you say you're not going to do it. Well, now I'm going to look at what you've done in the past. So if in the past you never have, well, okay, maybe you're not doing what your party ordinarily has done. So there's some basic rubrics we can use that get us out of our partisan filters, but nonetheless respect the fact that we're partisans for a reason. We have philosophical disagreements about how government ought to act. And sometimes the disagreement between people is really a deep philosophical disagreement that when we articulate it, we can actually find out, we can have an intelligent conversation. So Democrats on average are more disposed to act at the federal level. Republicans on average are more likely to say, make it state and local. So you know that, now you can have an intelligent discussion about, well, should we do X? And you say, yes, we should. Maybe the Republican would like to see it piloted at a local level or done at a local level. In general, Republicans want to move through private industry more so than Democrats. In general, so this is not always true. You come down to saying, should we agree something's needed? Sometimes what you're disagreeing about is who should do it. Sometimes what you're disagreeing about is how should it be done. We've got to find a way to depoliticize the way we talk to each other across political parties.
Yeah, everyone knows what happens when people assume. I don't need to finish that statement. So finally, for our last question, this transitions actually really well on the topic of the media and kind of trust in it. The media is accused of being liberal. Is that another myth, or is it possible? And how could the media restore its balanced credibility?
Okay, first, you've got to figure out what it is you mean by the media. There is no such thing. So when people say the media, remember, media is plural. Medium is signal, is singular. Media are, not media is. So there's a reason we say that. It's multiple things. It's lots of different things. So within a venue, you've got a whole range. So is Sean Hannity liberal or conservative? Sean Hannity is conservative. Well, what about Chris Wallace? He's on Fox News, and he's going to moderate the next debate. What about Bret Baier? He's on Fox News. No, he's in a news slot. He's not in an opinion slot on Fox News. So can we distinguish? Can you make a distinction between, the individuals who have as their norm a balanced norm, and you call that mainstream news? The Wall Street Journal, for me, in the news pages, is mainstream news. The Wall Street editorial page for me is a conservative webpage, a conservative editorial page. So the mainstream, now that doesn't mean there aren't assumptions underlying it. You're going to read more of your business news from Wall Street Journal, for example. But there are some frames inside mainstream that are more consistent with a democratic framing. And this is a different argument than people are ordinarily making. So to the extent that you see a problem identified in mainstream news and people say, what is government doing about it? That's an assumption that's hospitable to a Democratic ideology more so than a Republican ideology. Because a traditional Republican, and I'm saying traditional because the definition of what constitutes a Republican is a little bit broader and different now than it was before Donald Trump. But a traditional Republican would not say the first thing given a problem is, what is government doing about it? They would say, first, what are individuals doing about it? What are community groups doing about it, et cetera? And then if we're going to talk about government, they would say, what can local do? What can community do? What can county do? What can state do, et cetera? So to the extent that the mainstream news tends to go to what is government doing, there is built into that an assumption consistent with Democrats. But overall, am I comfortable with the assumption that there is a liberal and a conservative only at the extremes when you're pushing it hard? So Will I put Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity over in one part? Yes, I will. Will I put Rachel Maddow, HuffPo commentary over? Yes, I will. Will I put the editorial page of the Washington Post and the editorial page of the New York Times on the liberal side? Yes, I will. Will I put the Wall Street Journal editorial page? Yes, I will. There's a whole lot in between that's a whole lot more complex than that.
So I know I said that was the final question, but I just have one little build up off of that, actually, because you talk about the failures of the press during the slides. Do you think that journalists have learned their lesson since 2016?
I hope we're not going to have to find out. Remember, at this point in 2016, we had not had the drop of the Podesta hacked content. We'd only had the drop of the DNC content in summer. And so we don't know whether there's content that's going to be dropped. And frankly, since there are potential other international players, we don't know whether there's hacked content that might be dropped against the Republicans. So I don't want to find out. I don't want to know the answer to your question. Do I hope that they have? And have I laid out the criteria by which they ought to assess? Yes, I have tried to say, make sure you're independently verifying, or say that you have not, because that's important information. Remember that you have to source to the origin. Remember that you have to indicate what the context is for this and do it very, very carefully. Look at the motive of anybody who's in the distributional chain. Make sure that you apply traditional tests of newsworthiness to this. And also, in the process, make sure you never are taking things out of both the immediate and the broader context. That's just good journalism. So I have my tests ready if it happens again, but I hope I don't have an answer by the end of the election.
I hope you don't too. Thank you, everyone, for tuning on. This went really well from my perspective. And on behalf of the McCarthy Center and St. Ben's and St. John's, thank you, Dr. Jamieson, for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you on campus very soon.
Thank you. And I'm so proud to be part of your extended community.